Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be continuing my exploration of the complete Crepax with volume number 3, Evil Spells. As the title implies, this is a collection of Crepax's work that focuses on the supernatural. That includes the Baba Yaga storyline within the Valentina mythos, I guess you would call it, and then a number of adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and The Turn of the Screw. So a number of literary adaptations. Like with most of these volumes, they're collected thematically rather than chronologically. Given that the Valentina material follows a woman's throughout her life as she ages, I wish that material had been collected chronologically, but when you start to get the scope of what Crepax was up to, it definitely makes sense how they collect these. Also, the fact that he often does Valentina stories that within the internal chronology of the book are staggered in their actual release. It kind of makes sense how they're putting this together. And the more I read, the more I'm able to pretty much pick up on what's going on in the Valentina stories, even though they're not chronological within the story or within the publication schedule of it. It all tends to make sense. So I'm adapting to that better. And the more I read, the more I am enjoying these. So this is the Baba Yaga storyline, which I guess is in the Valentina world, one of the bigger stories. It was turned into a movie, which baffles my mind. I'll have to try and hunt that down. I can't imagine any of Crepax's stuff being a movie without just being completely pornographic. But anyways, this is an intro to a prologue to the Baba Yaga story that was illustrated in 1972. In this one, we're seeing Philip Rembrandt, Valentina's husband, at this point in the story, have a dream basically about her being abused by the Baba Yaga character. And you could see these golem-like figures, most of whom are, looking like these evil penis head guys getting ready to abuse Valentina. So that was in 1972. Then the actual Baba Yaga story is at least beginning being drawn in 1971. So that's one of the reasons that these things aren't put in the chronology of the releases. That's definitely a prologue, but the prologue wouldn't really make sense afterwards because it's like a dream that he's having beforehand about what's going to happen to Valentina. Then we jump into the actual story. This is Valentina, and she's watching a movie basically with Philip, and imagining herself in the movie. They're thinking about their son Mattia. I really like this movie strip down at the bottom here. This reminds me quite a bit of the scene at the end of, I think it's Eyes Wide Shut with Nicole Kidman, where you're just staring at her face for a few minutes. Just all these subtle, first off, the rhythmic nature, which I always talk about with Crepax's work, is really nice. But these aren't stats. These are all individually drawn with very subtle changes in her expression, eyes, lips. So that very cinematic, very slow, fast but slow playing out of Valentina's reactions to this whole scene in the movie. And you get a sense that, with the song going on here, this is 20-30 seconds of the movie, and then this is kind of a subdivision of that 20 seconds broken up in maybe every 2 or 3 seconds, something like that. So I really like that. That's, I think, some of the strongest stuff that Crepax does, is his sense of rhythm throughout a book and throughout a page. Then you get introduced to the Baba Yaga figure. It looks like an older debutante who has hired Valentina, who's a fashion photographer, to come take some pictures of her. Of course, the pictures turn erotic pretty quick. This being in 71, I think this for me is like peak Crepax, because there's still some traces of his like slapdash, really heavy textural brushwork that he does early on. That stuff that seemed to have really influenced Frank Miller. But he's starting to develop also that finer line, the very kind of delicate textures all throughout, the almost like Victorian type of illustration that you get a lot of Aubrey Beardsley type of imagery in here. I think it's a really good balance of his two approaches. I particularly like the early stuff, so having some remnant of that left in while he's developing this finer line work, I think is a real nice balance. All of his compositional stuff is on display here. Again, you can see all these really nice subdivisions, rhythms throughout. The one thing that Crepax does consistently in all of his work now, I thought it was something he grew out of, but it almost gets worse in his later work, is his paneling will go, in a way that you'll expect, and then he'll leave an arrow that leaves you here, and so you read and you're basically like done with the page, but then you're supposed to loop back here and then jump back over this image to that. Something he does a lot, and I'm not quite fond of that. In all of his awesome play with the overall picture of the page, the gestalt impression of the design of the page and the rhythms and stuff, that's always really nice. But when you're reading it sequentially as a comic, it doesn't always work. It does work when he puts images that you don't really need to read in order. Like here, you could kind of take these in any order you want. But things where there's dialogue and stuff, it does get pretty confusing. That's my biggest knock on him after reading a bunch of these. I thought it was something that was a problem for him early on because he was an illustrator coming to comics with no real background, but seems to be something that carries out for the majority of his career and the majority of his comics. So now you're getting these really cool sequence. Again, Crepax, I've got 8 volumes of these things now, and I never fail to find visually inventive pages. He's very playful all the way throughout. But these are some of the pictures that are being taken of Baba Yaga, and the fact that they're all within these circular frames, but again, designing like this meta composition over the page that has a very mod, like Andy Warhol approach to it. It's really cool. Some of the more photorealistic textural techniques going on in this panel in particular are really nice. Like I said, this is just kind of peak Crepax to me. Here's an example of Crepax doing his strange compositions in a way that really, really works. There's 2 scenes intermingling here. There's a scene of Valentina being attacked, and then also Philip in another place is being attacked. And this is just a really interesting technique to me. And this justifies kind of this jumble up of things happening in different places. It doesn't seem as important which order you read in. You just kind of get the sense that people are getting attacked, someone's getting stabbed with a needle, and all this stuff. I think it's cool. And then again, you get a look at this like heavier brushwork that he's doing balanced against the fine lines. A technique that Crepax starts using, it seems like in the early 70s, that I'm not such a fan of, and he carries it out for quite a while, is he'll go back in with reductive drawing. He'll do this white on the black where he's like either scratching out or using a very fine pen with some white ink. I think it disrupts the stark beauty of his, like the rhythms that he creates with his spotted blacks. But as he's developing this finer line, he's trying to put that into the blacks as well. So something that he definitely hasn't worked out here, and something that in this volume, I guess I'm finding there's plenty still where I think this guy's a master, and I'm trying to ape him and take techniques from him. But there's a couple little things like his storytelling and this that I don't like quite so much. This page here has a really interesting technique that he does a couple times in this volume. I'll be curious to see if he continues using it, where with his strange out of order pages, like this one's fine because you don't, again, some of this stuff can happen in any order, but he's doing a really cool, strange thing here where he has his arrows, which I'm never a fan of arrows in comics. That means something gone wrong in my opinion, but he's using it here really well because he's showing that this is happening while this is happening, and he's just kind of couching this in the composition. So I like that. It's kind of like an aspect, as Scott McCloud talks about it, but showing that these two things are related, and then going back to like having time flow on this side, while this is a more steady kind of image that carries over throughout these things, I think is an interesting technique that he's invented. I think I've never seen anyone else do that. So as the Baba Yaga story unfolds, at first it's a bit unclear why Baba Yaga has chosen Valentina, but she's definitely chosen Valentina for not just to be her photographer, but someone who she's basically haunting. You can see she has this board here that she's casting spells on. She's got a hold of her and she's torturing her in an erotic BDSM way, which is pretty standard for a Crepax story. It's a bit strange narratively for me that would be the go-to, but that's kind of, these are all erotic stories. At this point, it's not totally clear why it is that Baba Yaga has chosen Valentina in particular, But as the story continues, you realize that Baba Yaga is one of the subterranean characters that from volume one, and one of the early Valentina stories where Valentina is kidnapped by a subterranean species or a subterranean race. Her partner Philip, her husband Philip Rembrandt, he had started out as a superhero character where he's got these eyes that can freeze people, and it comes out that he is half subterranean, and that leads to a lot of the really interesting kind of psychological play for Valentina, where her trauma in life is coming from this species that she's frightened of, but then she finds out that the man she loves is part that as well, and that leads to a lot of the dreams and her erotic fantasies and stuff as she deals with her trauma. So in this one, this story that at first seems kind of like a superfluous torture story becomes this thing where Baba Yaga is actually also a subterranean, and she's trying to create a blind baby with his father's eyes. She's trying to basically make the new supreme leader of the subterraneans, and that's by capturing Philip Rembrandt. So Valentina is like a tool that she's using to get to Philip's DNA. And that, those are the things where Crepax, as much as I'm like hesitant about the BDSM nature of the work, he always tends to have a good narrative reason for it, and then he carries it out into like the real life impacts, psychological impacts on a character. So it's not completely just him being a perv and drawing what he wants. He's at least creating narrative reasons for all of it. Really, really beautiful composition right here. I think this is the most clearly I've seen Crepax acknowledge the fact that he's intentionally putting subdivisions and rhythms into his pages. You have Valentina walking along this gate that has all of these rhythmic subdivisions in it, with all these rhythmic subdivisions of the window back here. So you have a big set of polymeters or polyrhythms right here. And then Valentina, as people do when they walk by a fence or whatever, is brushing her fingers against it. And so you get the actual sound in there of the spacing of the polyrhythm. And so that's, or the rhythm in this case, that's really cool to me. I really like seeing it, and it kind of confirms my suspicion that it seems like the lots of the mentions of jazz that show up in like casually in conversations in the book were definitely an influence on Crepax's visual thinking as well. There's a really, really fun effect here as Valentina has like a imaginary sexual encounter where as she orgasms, she kind of melts into her environment. I think that's a pretty good visual way of showing the total absorption of that moment, where you can see the background behind her. And then as she starts to come out of it, you're getting like this warp distortion, almost like she's a piece of glass. Just another example of how Crepax is so visually inventive at all times, even though the content of his work stays pretty static throughout, I would say. As the story develops, Baba Yaga steals Philip and Valentina's child, Matthias. This is the page here where Valentina is realizing that Baba Yaga has stolen their child, again in the attempt to make this new great supreme for the underground subterranean race from the earlier volumes. Crepax uses the idea of like a witch doing magic on people. There's a lot of voodoo doll imagery in here where she's manipulating people from afar. So here you can see Baba Yaga's kind of like astrally projecting onto Valentina, basically taking sexual advantage of her. And then you could see here through the position of her hands that she's like puppeteering Valentina's body to have Valentina pleasure herself, but it's Baba Yaga doing it. So it's a really kind of gross idea of like rape from a distance, remote rape. But that, again, with Crepax, those things are always very uncomfortable to me. I don't really want to be reading stories about that, but he does it in a way that kind of makes sense within the context of the story. And again, the characters suffer traumatic, they have trauma to deal with. And so he's not just saying like this is an okay thing. And that makes the stories more compelling, at least that the trauma is part of it. This is the second. Now I'm looking at the second of a number of the Baba Yaga stories. So in this follow-up piece to the first one, now Philip and Valentina are basically invading Baba Yaga's secret lair, and they're finding all of these instances of her doing her kind of voodoo doll puppetry. And so here you see this mannequin that's made to look like Valentina tied to this bed frame, this wire bed frame, with this vulture creature whipping her back. And you think back to the first Baba Yaga story, and you have actual Valentina there being whipped. While she's being whipped, she's also having one of her dreams. That's one of the things that's formally interesting about this, is that he's using his erotic ideas a lot of the times to metaphorically represent like the inside of Valentina's mind as she's dealing with the real world tortures that she's undergoing, but also showing that there's like this voodoo doll aspect to it, where Baba Yaga still has this scenario set up later with the mannequin and all of these magic runes on Valentina's back. So there's an interesting continuity throughout all these stories, and that's why, again, I get why Fantagraphics collected these out of order. Like the thematic thing makes sense. I think some of the material, if it had all been packaged in one, like especially the adaptations, people would have been more likely to skip over it. So from a sales point, it makes sense. But there is a continuity to the Valentina stuff that I also find really compelling. She grows older, stories that are very surreal and seem to not make sense. You know, that one was in 71, this is in 72. Like these images will come back and you'll really get a sense of the broader scope of the story, even though when you're first reading any one of them, they feel very just surreal on the surface. There's a really nice sense of a solid thought through package as you go through things. That sense of a long-term continuity plays out even more with this continuing theme of the trauma of the Subterraneans, and you continue to learn more and more about what the Subterraneans wanted out of Valentina, and then you get, I think, the core of what Crepax himself is working out through doing these Valentina stories, and it makes all the uncomfortable content even more interesting to me. Basically, in this scene, you have some Subterraneans have come in. You see Baba Yaga as one of the Subterraneans. You know, she's really revealed as that. And this character here says, the cult of the Aran Tauwan is weakening. We're down to a handful of women, and we need a leader to fight the goddamn Iron Men. They took nearly all of our men. All right, Baba Yaga, treat her mercifully. Remember, she's part of our liturgy now. So here they have like faked that Valentina's pregnant and they're enacting this ceremony. But I started to really understand in this volume that Valentina is a Mother Mary figure to this subterranean underground, that she is the sacred woman. They talk about her a lot in the early volumes as the superior woman, or the woman from the, I forget what they say, but the woman above, something like that, Mother Superior, constantly kind of like this revered figure, and they definitely want her to bear their child, or they think her child with Rembrandt's going to be some kind of like savior figure. Knowing that Crepax is Italian, and knowing that these came out in the late 60s, early 70s, and you're starting to see a lot of the themes of fascism in his work as well, I really start to see that this is a big canvas for Crepax to work out his own kind of discomforts with, probably, I'm assuming, being the first generation of children that were born directly after World War II and fascist Italy. So he's looking both at, I'm assuming, a Catholic upbringing and the cultural history of fascism. And that's where a lot of the kind of abusive BDSM stuff comes from as well, is kind of like mapping this fascist authoritarian thing on top of it. And then here you see very clearly that Valentina's like this mystical mother figure, Mother Mary figure to this subterranean race. And really like putting Mother Mary to me in a new light, where you've taken an average woman and by mapping this crazy mythology on top of her, you are creating all of this trauma for her because of the expectations, and then delving into the societal expectations and all of that as well. It's another one of those things where all of the uncomfortable content has this really, really valid real world concerns. There's like real emotional issues that Crepax must have been working out about his own culture, the sins of his culture, that he's really working out, and I can see why like the Valentina character I've read enough of the interviews to see that he originally just intended to do a superhero story with Rembrandt, and Valentina took over, and he couldn't help it. This is just like his own psychotherapy doing these stories, it seems like, and that makes them very, very interesting to me. And within the same story, which is called The Little King, this is the one where I realized that Valentina is very much meant to be this Mother Mary figure. Then you see also the fascism with like this spike on the hat, this people worshiping this kind of big parade thing. They're also doing this ceremony here where they're talking about there will be a little king. So that idea of the savior child, the small king, and they're even saying a great supreme shall come again. All hail the great supreme. So like a few pages later within the same story, I went, oh, this is like all, Catholicism and his generation, and it must tie into fascism. I get that exactly a few pages later. And yeah, I think on this volume, the Valentina stuff for me, I see why this is not just, the art is so legendary for a really good reason, but the stories are considered very deep and literate and a good example of erotic literature, not just like pornography on their own. Is something that when I tried to read them more out of order as I got the volumes, I wasn't grasping onto that. You really got to read this stuff in a whole and got to stick with it and be open to all of the strange little like tricks that Crepax plays about moving in and out of reality to track it. But once you get the rhythm of what he's doing, these stories I think are really, really interesting. In the Little King story, we go down into a more sci-fi environment, just some cool visuals here. So this is Iron Man in a crystal city, and he's got all of these cool like Iron Man characters. When he starts designing science fiction stuff, it's really strange. It's not like anything else I've ever seen. And then you also see Rembrandt here with these crystals growing all over him. So just some cool visuals that go outside of that typical like Beardsley, Aubrey Beardsley Victorian style that Crepax doing a lot. Leads to some really cool wild compositions here, some big compositions where these characters are like walking through these tunnels all throughout. Just really, really, again, being visually inventive and playful. You could tell that he always had a lot of fun when he was at the board, and it seems like he's trying to never repeat a layout too, which is a crazy thing to think that you're never going to have the same layout. But I get the sense that if I went through and looked at these, I wouldn't find a single page that shared the same panellation, which is a hell of a feat. This page has a lot of that like topsy-turvy anti-gravity stuff that I've noticed. Crepax also has an interest in a number of his stories that happen in outer space. He's got these tumbly-turvy compositions. This is no different here, but in this one you see Baba Yaga again playing with like the characters as dolls, manipulating them from afar. So it makes this idea of invasion and rape even creepier, because it's like it not only entering someone's body and taking over for your own purposes, but taking over a mind. And it leads to these really, really fun compositions like this, really strange but beautiful ways of chopping up a page. Then we jump way forward to a story called Rembrandt and the Witches. This is now in 1977, so 5 years later, where this is a story focused on Rembrandt and an encounter with witches. I don't think they're the same. I don't think it's the Baba Yaga in this story. Just more of the subdivision stuff that I quite like from Crepax, having all of these slanted tiers here. And then, we could have just had Philip walking along smoking his pipe, but all of these little inset panels and watching the pipe bounce up and down just add a lot more sense of time and rhythm throughout this. You also get that here with the phone. Every time I do one of these videos about Crepax, I'm just going to be pointing that out, I'm sure, because it's one of the things that originally drew me to him. This is a really cool way of doing like a kind of Scott McCloud aspect to aspect, but also moment to moment type of transition at once, which is a really hard thing to pull off. But you have Philip now entering like an antique store or something, and you get the big scene of the store, and then you get his eyes bouncing around, even blinking, and then like, so you have 4 eyes. This is more rhythm and subdivision stuff. You have a 7 over this whole span here, but then it's broken up into 4 eyes and 3 objects, and so you get a blink here, like a rest in the rhythm as he's not perceiving one of the objects. Also, you have his face here reflected in the mirror that he's looking at, and then you get some other cool stuff like a clock going on here. Eventually, Rembrandt settles on this box that he finds very interesting, of these cubes with ladies' faces painted on them, but one of them's missing, and then these are the witches that he'll encounter. Another really nice, really playful effect here that still has the rhythmic stuff built into it as well. But Philip's in the shower, and he's like rubbing his eyes as you would in the shower, and starting to get these images of these witches, and then he looks out and sees a witch in the shower, and then rubs his eyes again, and you see that it's just his bath towel. So those interesting moments where you just get a glance of something and your mind fills in the wrong thing and it resolves a second later, and then breaking up that time with these other rhythmic subdivisions, I think is just a really, really great way of representing that psychological state where you get like a half a second hallucination. In this one, Philip is the person who gets attacked. So it's not only women that are being assaulted in these stories. Everyone's getting assaulted. You can see the witches grabbing onto him here. This panel is particularly interesting where it's drawn as if the surface that they're on, the road, the pavement or whatever that they're on, is made of glass, and you're seeing it from the bottom. So some more of that cool anti-gravity stuff, but it also just gives a really interesting shot that you wouldn't see if you weren't doing that. Also, I'm sure a good reason for an upskirt shot. So this ends the Valentina material for this book. It's about half of the book. It's a 400 some odd page book, and this is about 250 pages in. Then we get 3 adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe's Auguste Dupin stories, his like Sherlock Holmes-esque character. The first one, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, is the one that I'm familiar with, where you have the orangutan killing the woman and stuffing her up the chimney. I really, really like this. Basically, there's a title page here, and then this first page which sets out like all of the facts of the mystery. So again, some really cool aspect to aspect stuff where you get the whole scene of the crime here, and then you get these zooms in on all of the little details that Dupin notices. You get the woman stuffed up the chimney, which is like a perfect thing for Crepax, right? Like this almost BDSM trap type of thing there, this abused body. So these are really cool, and I think fit his style perfectly. There's a lot of the rhythmic stuff because he gets to go into like these diagrammatic explanations as the detective solves the mystery. So he's pointing out like the nails, and it really does look like an instructional manual here of how the windows latch together and everything. I think it really fits Crepax's style well. You can see also a lot of those kind of inner panel rhythms where like this lines up to this and it breaks it into quarters, and just like the way these line up to the window here. A lot of that stuff that I find really inspirational from him. Even this palm kind of turning down into that line there. These Edgar Allan Poe seem perfectly fit for his approach. This one's an early one. You can tell by the art style. There's a lot more black. It looks like a lot more brushwork, and it is. It's from '67, but again, a good mix of the more textural stuff with the big black stuff. I think this early Crepax is some of my favorite. Then you get the next one is The Mystery of Marie Roget from 1970. So these aren't like things that he did all at once. These are things that he came back to throughout the course of his career. Again, a lot of the details of the mystery that needs to be solved being played out here. And again, like an abused woman, so it fits. You can see why it would fit. He won't want to draw, I don't know why you would want to draw the corpses of women, but there you go. Then the third one, The Purloined Letter, is all the way in 1990. This is a really good example also of Crepax's reading order nightmares that persist into later in his career. I think you're supposed to read like this and down into here, but there's an arrow, even though it's subdivided off as like this panel here. There's an arrow when you get to here that kind of points you down to here, and then you think you need to go up to here. It would be pretty obvious to me to read across like this if he had just left it, because it's flowing left to right so easily. And then he's also doing this strange thing where he's like just twisting one word sideways and then putting it here, and then you kind of have to read here and then over there. So it's something that as he plays with, I think, trying to never repeat a composition, he kind of runs into these things where they don't really work. And, this choice to put the arrow there made something that I didn't think was too confusing, particularly confusing. Also, there's some of these like really strong gestures, like this hand coming down almost makes me want to visually follow to here. And then this finger pointing, there's a lot of strange directional forces on this page. After the Poe material, then you get the 1986-87 adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Really enjoy, again, the subdivision, the musicality here of the 3 against 4 is the feet walking. So you can tell this is a character who's running or walking faster, and this is a character who's plodding along more slowly. You know, for every 4 times that her feet hit, he's only stepped like once, basically. This foot comes forward so slowly. There's also some fun stuff in this page that does help the reading order, where there's a tangent. So this comes here and wraps right to this character, and then you have this split down the middle of the page that splits the panel, splits her face, and then turns into this character's just like the middle of his coat. Those kind of things are what Crepax does really well, that help lead the reader through the page. In this sequence, still from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you see Crepax playing so much that he's playing with a standard feature of his comics, which is on every page you can find a signature by him, and that's how I'm always knowing what the dates are. Actually, this is 85 and 86. Sorry, I said it 86, 87. This is 85, 86. And there's always a signature here with a date on it. On this page, as the transformation between Jekyll and Hyde is happening, and the panels get all weird and there's all these distortions to the images, Crepax also goes ahead and distorts his signature to fit. And this signature says 85, this says 86. I noticed in this story that there's a lot of like fill-ins where these more large spread pages that I can't show because they're pretty graphic were done later. So it's almost like he saved all the fun stuff for last. But I really like this trick that he's playing. The fact that he's even thinking about his signature as something that he can play with to help, move the story forward is very fascinating to me. Another fun visual trick in this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde story is you have here the horse-drawn buggy, and the buggy and the horse itself cross the panel borders, but the background changes. I think that's a really interesting way to show forward motion and change of time also within a static image. I'm not sure I've ever seen it quite handled like that either, which seems like a pretty obvious trick to play, but I can't think of any other time I've seen someone play that trick. And again, it helps him maintain like this sense of subdivision in his page. Really nice slow morph transition here as Jekyll turns into Mr. Hyde. That seems like it would be very hard to figure out, like pre-morph programs and stuff like that. 86, that he's figuring this all out. Really fun kind of animation style going on. Well, not style, but tricks going on there. Really interesting stuff. And then the final story here is The Turn of the Screw. I'm not familiar with the original story there, so I don't know if it's as erotic in nature as this one is. I get the sense that the original story is just more of like a ghost haunting, and Crepax took the ghost as, made it sexual. But this one's really interesting because it's got a very like Art Deco mod style throughout the story, which works really well with Crepax's sense of composition. I know a lot of his style looks more Victorian, Aubrey Beardsley in nature, but the way he panels and subdivides does seem very much related to Frank Lloyd Wright and other artists and architects along that line with the subdivisions and the panelings. And you can even see that in like the furniture back here that he's got, and just the compositions it allows him to make, where he's using these swirls, has these interesting modernist statues. I think that fits his style very well, and I would like to see more done in that style. I think Crepax would do a really good, I don't know why he would be doing it, but a Great Gatsby story would be really interesting from him. I think that one would also have like a lot of the sexual undertones that he would probably make more explicit. Another thing that this style allows him to do is have a lot more like diagonal subdivisions, where he can work on not just a grid of 90 degree angles, but a grid of 45s crossing that as well. And that would be something I don't know if he does that in any of his other work, but it's definitely something that could spice up his compositions even more. So there's little bits of it in this story, but this story overall is like one of the less interesting ones to me, artistically. The compositional things that are allowed because of the Art Deco is pretty cool, but the story itself and a lot of the imagery in here just didn't seem the most inspired. Also, this being later in the 70s, you see that he's definitely gone more towards this really fine pin line. This one has a little bit of the nice brushy textural work that I like from him but it's definitely contained to more of the scratchy pen work. So the compositional stuff's there, but some of the power of his work is gone for me when you get rid of that big brushy strokes. So that's volume 3, Evil Spells, and by this point I'm pretty committed to doing a video for all of these because I continue to find new things to talk about. The Valentina stuff continues to really fascinate me. So I'm sold on this. I have all 8 that have come out so far, so hopefully we'll be doing one every couple of weeks on the channel. The Eisner nominated The Strange Death of Alex Raymond by Dave Sim and myself. This is a gorgeously illustrated and designed book. Dave doing most of the illustration. Amazing compositions throughout. What Dave is doing is he's recording his obsession with the death of master cartoonist Alex Raymond behind the wheel of Stan Drake's car when they got into a car crash. The best description of the book that I've heard is that it's like understanding comics with pages like this mixed with something like From Hell when you get into the theories about what actually happened with the car crash. And then with Sean on production, it's just one of the most gorgeously printed books you could get a hold of.